Shaquille, Big Shaq, Johnson stepped off the crowded subway, adjusting his hood to shield himself from the biting autumn wind. The city pulsed with life around him, business people rushing to meetings, street performers entertaining tourists, and the occasional aroma of roasted chestnuts wafting from a nearby cart. It was a scene Shaq had grown used to, a far cry from the quiet streets of his childhood. In his left hand, he clutched a worn leather notebook, a relic from his younger days when he would jot down ideas for his future. Today, that future was a reality. Shaq was the owner of a chain of successful restaurants, each one a testament to years of hard work, perseverance, and a philosophy rooted in kindness and respect. Yet, despite his success, he had never allowed himself to lose touch with the values that had brought him here. This visit was different. Shaq had made it a point to visit his establishments unannounced, blending in with the crowd to see the truth behind the polished exteriors. He believed that how a business treated the invisible people, dishwashers, janitors, and unassuming customers, was a reflection of its true character. Tonight, he was visiting one of his most prestigious locations, a swanky restaurant tucked away in an affluent part of the city. As he approached the sleek glass doors, a rush of nervous energy hit him. He wasn't nervous about being recognized. In fact, he was counting on his plain attire and unassuming demeanor to keep him anonymous. What made his chest tighten was the uncertainty of what he might discover. Would this restaurant reflect the values he had worked so hard to instill? Or would he find something else, a culture that contradicted everything he stood for? The warmth of the restaurant enveloped him as he stepped inside. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the tables, each set with pristine white linens and gleaming silverware. The soft hum of jazz music filled the air, blending seamlessly with the murmur of conversations. It was a picture of luxury. "Excuse me," Shaq said, stepping toward the host's stand. The young hostess barely glanced up, her manicured fingers busy tapping on a screen. "One moment," she muttered, her tone clipped. Shaq nodded, his patience unwavering. Years of dealing with dismissive attitudes had taught him to remain calm. He stepped aside, observing the restaurant as he waited. The servers moved with precision, their trays balancing glasses of wine and plates of artistic dishes. Everything seemed to be running smoothly, but Shaq's eyes weren't focused on the surface. He was looking for cracks. "Are you lost, sir?" The voice came from behind him, sharp and laced with condescension. Shaq turned to see a waiter, his neatly pressed uniform and polished shoes a stark contrast to Shaq's casual hoodie and sneakers. "No," Shaq replied evenly. "I'm here for dinner." The waiter, whose name tag read Trevor, raised an eyebrow, his gaze raking over Shaq's outfit. "This isn't exactly a burger joint," he said, smirking. Shaq smiled, ignoring the jab. "I'll try to manage." Trevor sighed dramatically and gestured toward the hostess, who now seemed mildly interested in Shaq's presence. "Table for one," Trevor said to her, his tone making it clear he found the request absurd. "Follow me," the hostess said, grabbing a menu. Shaq followed her through the restaurant, passing tables adorned with couples, business partners, and groups of friends. He could feel Trevor's gaze burning into his back, and he couldn't help but wonder how many other customers had been on the receiving end of such treatment. The hostess placed the menu on a small table near the back of the room. "Your server will be with you shortly," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. Shaq sat down, glancing around the room as he opened the menu. The prices were steep, as expected, but Shaq wasn't here for the food. He was here for the experience, the kind of experience any customer should have, regardless of their appearance. A few minutes later, Trevor appeared at his table, his notepad in hand. "Have you decided, or do you need help navigating the menu?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Shaq chuckled softly. "I'll have the grilled salmon and a glass of sparkling water, please." Trevor scribbled the order and nodded. "Anything else?" "No, that'll be all." "Thank you," Shaq replied, his tone calm. Trevor lingered for a moment, as if waiting for Shaq to say or do something that would justify his dismissive attitude. When Shaq didn't, Trevor walked away, shaking his head. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had seen enough to know there was a problem. Trevor's behavior wasn't just about him. It was about a culture that allowed such attitudes to persist. As Shaq sipped his water, he overheard snippets of conversation from nearby tables. A couple complaining about slow service. A junior staff member being scolded by a senior one. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and the picture wasn't pretty. He glanced down at his notebook, his fingers brushing over the leather cover. This was what he had feared, not the cracks in the walls, but the cracks in the foundation. The restaurant was beautiful on the outside, but it lacked the heart he had built his business on. As Trevor returned with his food, Shaq offered a polite smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. Trevor gave a curt nod and walked away, leaving Shaq alone with his thoughts. He knew what he had to do. The question wasn't whether he could fix the problem, it was how. And he would start with Trevor. Shaq watched as Trevor glided through the restaurant, his movements deliberate and confident, his interactions sharp but shallow. The waiter had an air of superiority that seemed to hang over him like a cloud, casting a shadow over every customer and colleague he encountered. It wasn't just Trevor's attitude that bothered Shaq, it was the way the other staff seemed to accept it as normal. No one called him out. No one challenged his behavior. Instead, they moved around him with a quiet resignation, as if his biting remarks and smug demeanor were just another part of their daily routine. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room. He noticed a young busman nervously clearing plates at a nearby table. His hands trembled as he tried to balance a stack of dishes, and when one fork slipped and clattered to the ground, his face turned crimson. Trevor appeared beside him almost instantly, his voice dripping with disdain. "Do you even know how to carry a tray, Miguel? Or is this your first day on Earth?" Miguel mumbled an apology, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Apologies don't clean floors," Trevor snapped. "Pick it up and try not to embarrass yourself again." Shaq's jaw tightened as he watched the exchange. Miguel hurried off, his shoulders hunched, and Shaq could see the shame etched into his young face. It was a face Shaq recognized all too well, because once upon a time, it had been his own. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. He had been 16, working as a dishwasher at a small diner. His hands raw from scrubbing pots, his body aching from long shifts. Back then, he'd been humiliated more times than he could count, by impatient chefs, rude customers, and once by a manager who had called him useless in front of the entire staff. Shaq had promised himself that if he ever had the chance to lead, he would do it differently. And now, here he was, watching the very kind of behavior he had sworn to eradicate thrive under his own roof. Trevor returned to Shaq's table, his expression bored. "How's the food?" he asked, his tone making it clear he didn't really care about the answer. "It's good," Shaq said, his voice calm. "But I've been paying more attention to the service." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what's your verdict?" Shaq smiled faintly, leaning forward. "I think there's room for improvement." Trevor smirked. "Well, not everyone can handle an establishment like this. We cater to a certain kind of clientele." Shaq's smile didn't waver, but his eyes sharpened. "And what kind is that?" Trevor shrugged. "The kind that belongs here." Shaq leaned back, letting the waiter's words hang in the air. There was no point in responding, not yet. Instead, he wanted to observe more, to understand the full scope of the problem before addressing it. As Trevor walked away, Shaq turned his attention to the rest of the staff. He noticed a young waitress struggling to balance a tray of drinks. A chef barking orders at a line cook who looked like he hadn't slept in days. A manager standing off to the side, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the tension simmering in the room. The cracks in the foundation were everywhere, and Shaq felt the weight of them pressing on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one arrogant waiter. It was about a culture that allowed arrogance to flourish, a culture that he had unintentionally allowed to grow under his watch. The evening wore on, and as the restaurant began to empty, Shaq saw his opportunity to dig deeper. He approached Miguel as the young busboy wiped down a table, his movements slow and methodical. "Hey," Shaq said gently. Miguel looked up, startled. "Oh, hi. Can I help you?" Shaq smiled. "I just wanted to say you're doing a good job." Miguel blinked, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Really? I mean, thanks." Shaq nodded. "I know it's not easy, especially with the pressure around here. But I see how hard you're working." Miguel hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "It's not always like this. I mean, the job's fine, but Trevor..." He glanced around nervously. "He makes it harder than it needs to be." Shaq's heart sank. He wanted to say something reassuring, but he knew words alone wouldn't fix the situation. "Do you ever talk to the manager about it?" he asked. Miguel shrugged. "What's the point? The manager doesn't care. He just wants the place to run smoothly." Shaq thanked Miguel and returned to his table, his thoughts racing. It was clear now, this wasn't just a Trevor problem. It was a leadership problem. And as the owner, the ultimate responsibility rested with him. As he stood to leave, Trevor intercepted him at the door, his smirk firmly in place. "Heading out? Hope we didn't scare you off." Shaq met his gaze, his voice steady. "I'll be back." There was a flicker of confusion in Trevor's eyes, but he quickly masked it with a laugh. "Sure thing, champ." As Shaq stepped into the cool night air, he felt a familiar fire ignite within him. This restaurant was more than just a business, it was a reflection of his values, his legacy. And he wasn't about to let it crumble. The next morning, Shaq sat in his home office, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. His desk, usually tidy, was now cluttered with notes and reports from the restaurant he had visited the previous night. Each piece of paper felt like a reminder of his responsibility, and the weight of it all settled heavily on his shoulders. As he flipped through a staff roster, his phone buzzed beside him. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his assistant, Layla. "Layla, do you need me to arrange a meeting with the restaurant manager today?" Shaq stared at the message for a moment before replying. "Shaq, not yet. I'll handle this one myself, *. He knew that if he wanted real answers, he needed to dig deeper, without the buffer of his title or the formalities that came with it. For now, he would remain anonymous. Later that afternoon, Shaq walked through the restaurant's back entrance, blending in with the hustle and bustle of the kitchen. The staff barely noticed him as they prepared for the dinner rush, their movements efficient but tense. He observed quietly, taking in the sharp voices of the chefs, the clatter of utensils, and the nervous energy that seemed to hang over the room. Shaq's plan was simple: spend the day as an ordinary worker, get his hands dirty, and see the operation from the ground up. He spotted Miguel by the dishwashing station, his face already flushed with effort as he scrubbed a mountain of plates. "Need an extra pair of hands?" Shaq asked, stepping beside him. Miguel blinked in surprise but quickly nodded. Sure. You don't mind?" Shaq rolled up his sleeves. "Not at all." The two worked in silence for a while, the steady rhythm of washing dishes filling the space between them. Finally, Miguel spoke. "So, you're not from here, are you?" Shaq chuckled. "What gave me away?" Miguel shrugged. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who'd normally walk in here and start washing dishes." Shaq smiled but didn't elaborate. "Let's just say I'm here to learn." Miguel seemed to accept the answer, though his curiosity lingered. As they worked, Shaq observed the dynamics around them. He noticed how Trevor barked orders at the waitstaff, how the kitchen manager seemed more interested in berating than encouraging, and how the younger employees avoided eye contact, moving like shadows through the chaos. At one point, Trevor entered the kitchen, his voice booming. "Miguel! Table 7 needs clearing. Move it!" Miguel flinched, dropping the plate he had been holding. It shattered on the floor, and Trevor's face twisted in irritation. "For crying out loud, can you do anything right?" Trevor snapped. Shaq stepped forward before Miguel could respond. "It was an accident," he said evenly. Trevor turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in Shaq's presence. "And who are you supposed to be?" Just helping out, Shaq replied calmly, meeting Trevor's gaze. Trevor scoffed. Well, maybe stick to what you know and leave the real work to the professionals. Shaq didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he bent down to help Miguel clean up the broken plate, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Trevor muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving the tension in the room hanging like a storm cloud. Miguel's voice was barely a whisper. You didn't have to do that. Shaq glanced at him, his expression kind. Sometimes, people need to be reminded what real leadership looks like. As the day turned into evening, Shaq continued to immerse himself in the restaurant's operations. He spoke to the kitchen staff, learning about their struggles and frustrations. He listened to the servers, who vented about Trevor's arrogance and the manager's indifference. Each conversation painted a clearer picture of the systemic issues plaguing the restaurant. But it wasn't until Shaq sat down with Rosa, the head waitress, that he fully grasped the emotional toll the environment had taken on the team. We try our best, Rosa said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. But it's hard to stay motivated when you feel like no one has your back. Trevor walks all over people, and the manager just shrugs it off. It's like they've forgotten we're human. Shaq nodded, his heart heavy with empathy. What keeps you going? He asked gently. Rosa hesitated, then smiled faintly. The customers. When someone leaves happy, when they thank me for making their night special, it reminds me why I started this job in the first place. Her words struck a chord with Shaq. He had built his restaurants on the belief that food wasn't just about sustenance. It was about connection, community, and care. And here was Rosa, embodying that philosophy despite the challenges she faced. As their conversation ended, Shaq knew what he had to do. It was time to take action. The next morning, Shaq arrived early, his notebook in hand. He gathered the staff in the dining room, his presence drawing curious glances. Trevor stood off to the side, his arms crossed and his expression skeptical. Good morning, Shaq began, his voice steady but firm. I'm Shaquille Johnson. I own this restaurant. A ripple of shock passed through the room, followed by a tense silence. Trevor's smirk faltered, and Rosa's eyes widened in surprise. I've spent the last few days observing, Shaq continued, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. This restaurant is more than just a business to me, it's a reflection of everything I believe in. And right now, I see a lot that needs to change. He let his words sink in before turning his gaze to Trevor. Starting with how we treat each other. Trevor's face turned red, but he didn't speak. Shaq looked around the room, his voice softening. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about building a culture where everyone feels valued and respected. That starts today. He opened his notebook, revealing a list of initiatives designed to improve morale, communication, and accountability. As he outlined his vision, he could see the staff's initial apprehension giving way to cautious optimism. When he finished, he looked at the group with determination. I'm not here to dictate, I'm here to lead. And I need all of you to help me rebuild what we've lost. The room was silent for a moment, then Rosa stepped forward. I'm in, she said, her voice steady. One by one, the staff nodded, their expressions a mix of hope and determination. Shaq's eyes met Trevor's. This is your chance to prove you belong here, he said. But that choice is yours. Trevor hesitated, his jaw tight, but he finally gave a curt nod. As the staff dispersed, Shaq felt a spark of hope ignite within him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to fight for the heart of his restaurant. The energy in the restaurant shifted in the days that followed Shaq's announcement. His words had sparked a ripple of hope, but hope alone wouldn't solve the deeply ingrained issues. Change required effort, understanding, and time, and not everyone was ready to embrace it. Shaq arrived early each morning, determined to lead by example. He joined the staff in setting up the dining area, checking inventory, and even scrubbing floors when necessary. The team began to see that his commitment wasn't just for show. Yet, despite his efforts, resistance simmered beneath the surface. Trevor, in particular, was a thorn in his side. While he no longer openly antagonized others, his reluctance to fully engage was obvious. He kept his distance during team meetings, his arms crossed and his gaze skeptical. His attitude threatened to undermine the fragile trust Shaq was trying to rebuild. One afternoon, Shaq found Rosa in the break room, sitting with her head in her hands. He knocked gently on the doorframe before stepping inside. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked up, her face weary. "Just tired," she admitted. "It feels like every step forward comes with 2 steps back. Trevor still acts like he's untouchable, and the new policies, they're great in theory, but getting everyone on board is a whole other story." Shaq pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Change is hard," he said. "Especially when people are used to things being a certain way. But I've seen the way you interact with customers and your team. You're the glue holding this place together, Rosa. If anyone can help me turn things around, it's you." Her eyes softened, but doubt lingered in her expression. "What if it's not enough?" Shaq leaned forward, his tone earnest. "It will be, as long as we don't give up. One day, one person, one small victory at a time. That's how we win." The next week, Shaq organized a team-building exercise after hours. The staff gathered in the dining room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. On the tables were sheets of paper and markers, along with bowls of snacks and drinks to create a relaxed atmosphere. "Tonight's not about work," Shaq began, standing at the front of the room. "It's about getting to know each other and remembering why we're here." He handed out the papers and markers, explaining the activity. Each person would write or draw something that represented their passion, what drove them, what brought them joy, and share it with the group. The room buzzed with quiet chatter as the staff got to work. Shaq moved among them, offering encouragement and sharing his own story. When it was time to share, Rosa was the first to speak. She held up her paper, which showed a sketch of a simple, cozy dining table. "This reminds me of my grandmother's house," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "She always said a good meal could heal anything. That's why I got into this business, to create moments like that for other people." The room was silent, her words resonating with the group. One by one, others shared their stories. A young dishwasher named Ava talked about how her mother's sacrifices inspired her to work hard. Miguel, shy as ever, revealed his dream of one day opening his own food truck. When it was Trevor's turn, he hesitated. His paper was blank. "I don't have anything to share," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Shaq spoke up, his tone gentle but firm. "Everyone has a story, Trevor. Maybe you just need to take a moment to find yours." Trevor shrugged, his expression guarded, but the vulnerability in the room seemed to affect him. He stayed quiet for the rest of the evening, but something in his demeanor had shifted. The following day, Shaq noticed small changes. Rosa smiled more often. Miguel began taking initiative in the kitchen. Even Trevor seemed less combative, though he still kept to himself. But progress wasn't linear. One evening, during a particularly busy dinner service, tensions flared. An order was delayed, and Trevor snapped at Ava, blaming her for the mistake. Shaq intervened immediately. "Trevor, can I see you in the office?" he said, his tone calm but firm. Trevor followed reluctantly, his jaw tight. Once inside, Shaq closed the door and leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "What's going on?" he asked. Trevor scowled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been walking around with a chip on your shoulder since the day I got here. If there's something you want to say, now's the time." For a moment, Trevor didn't respond. Then, his shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy sigh. "Look, I've been here for years," he said. "I worked my way up from nothing. And now you come in and act like you can fix everything overnight. It's frustrating." Shaq nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that," he said. "But this isn't about me or you. It's about the team, the customers, the future of this place. I'm not here to take anything away from you, Trevor. I'm here to make it better, for all of us." Trevor looked at him, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "And what if it doesn't work?" Shaq smiled faintly. "Then we try again. and again. Until it does. As the days turned into weeks, the restaurant began to transform. The team worked together more cohesively, the atmosphere became lighter, and customers noticed the difference. Rosa's warmth, Miguel's quiet determination, and even Trevor's grudging acceptance played a role in the turnaround. But Shaq knew the journey was far from over. True change took time, and there were still challenges ahead. One evening, as Shaq locked up the restaurant, he caught Trevor lingering by the door. "Need a ride home?" Shaq offered. Trevor hesitated, then nodded. As they drove through the quiet streets, Trevor finally spoke. "I don't know if I've said it, but thanks for giving me another chance." Shaq glanced at him, his expression kind. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Trevor. What matters is what you do with it." Trevor nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. As Shaq dropped him off, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. The restaurant wasn't just a business, it was a family. And like any family, it would face its share of struggles. But with every step forward, they were proving that growth and redemption were possible. Shaq sat alone in his office, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. The restaurant was quieter than usual tonight, a lull between the dinner and late-night rush. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on him. Progress had been slow, but steady. Staff morale was up, and there had been a noticeable shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. But the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach had only grown stronger with each passing day. It started small, slight miscommunications, little errors here and there. But now, Shaq was seeing something that troubled him more. Resistance wasn't just coming from Trevor anymore. It was spreading, creeping into the hearts of some of the other employees. Subtle, but noticeable. He picked up his phone and dialed Rosa's number. "Hey, Rosa. You got a minute?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, of course. What's up?" she replied, her voice as warm as always. "I need to talk to you about something. Can we meet after your shift?" "Sure, I'll be done in an hour." Shaq clicked off the phone, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. He'd spent the last few days noticing a shift in Rosa's attitude. She was still friendly, still trying to keep things positive, but something had changed. Her usual spark was dimming, and he had to find out why. An hour later, Shaq met Rosa outside the restaurant. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the parking lot. The cool evening air brushed against his skin, but the tension in his chest made the breeze feel strangely suffocating. "Everything okay?" Rosa asked as she approached, her brow furrowed in concern. "I should be asking you that," Shaq said, offering her a half-smile. "Something's been off. You don't seem like yourself lately." Rosa hesitated for a moment, then looked down at her feet, her fingers toying with the strap of her purse. "I've been trying to hold it together, Shaq. But it's not easy." Shaq's gaze softened. "What's going on?" She sighed, clearly struggling to find the right words. It's like everything is falling apart. People are trying, but we're all just spinning our wheels. I know you've been working hard to make changes, but not everyone is on board. I don't think they understand what you're trying to do." Shaq felt a pang in his chest. He knew it wasn't easy, but hearing it from someone who had been his strongest ally hit harder than he expected. He had hoped that the changes he'd implemented would be enough to build lasting trust and loyalty. But the truth was, even his closest team members were struggling. "Is it just Trevor?" he asked quietly, already knowing the answer. "No," she replied, shaking her head. "It's not just him. There's been a shift in the whole team. People are starting to doubt. They feel like they're being asked to change too much, too fast." Shaq felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. "What are we supposed to do, then?" he asked, the frustration seeping into his voice. "I can't force anyone to change, but I also can't let this place fall apart." Rosa placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft. "I'm not saying give up, Shaq. I'm saying we need to slow down. Maybe it's time to listen more, to understand where the team is coming from. If we push too hard, we might lose them." He looked into her eyes, searching for the right words. He had been so focused on fixing everything that he had missed the bigger picture, the people who were supposed to make the changes happen. He had failed to notice how their fears, their doubts, and their insecurities had started to weigh on them. And now, those feelings were threatening to undo everything he had worked for. "Maybe you're right," Shaq said quietly. "Maybe I've been pushing too hard." Rosa smiled faintly. "It's not about slowing down the vision, it's about finding the balance. If you can help the team understand why it's important, they'll come around." Shaq nodded, feeling a shift in himself. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a clearer path forward. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle to figure out, the biggest obstacle of all, Trevor. That night, after the dinner rush, Shaq found himself standing in the middle of the restaurant, watching Trevor as he wiped down tables. The younger man's movements were quick, almost robotic, and Shaq could sense the underlying tension in every action. He took a deep breath and walked over to Trevor, who didn't even acknowledge his presence. "Trevor," Shaq said gently, "can we talk?" Trevor paused for a moment, then glanced up, his expression closed off. "What about?" "I've been thinking," Shaq began, choosing his words carefully. "I know things have been tough around here. But I need to hear from you. I need to know what you're thinking, what's going on in your head." Trevor let out a bitter laugh. "You really want to know? Fine. I don't think anyone's listening to me. I've been here longer than anyone else, and yet it feels like all these changes are happening without anyone asking for my opinion. It's frustrating." Shaq absorbed the frustration in Trevor's voice. It wasn't just about the changes, it was about being overlooked. He had been so focused on the bigger picture that he had failed to consider how alienating this process could feel to the people who had been there long before he arrived. "I get it," Shaq said softly. "I'm not here to push you out, Trevor. I just need you to understand why we need these changes. And more importantly, I need you to be part of them." Trevor looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll try. But it's hard, Shaq. You've got to show us you're with us, not just above us." Shaq met his gaze, understanding the weight of his words. "I'll do better. I'll listen more. And I'll make sure you have a voice in this. You matter here." Trevor didn't respond immediately, but the tension between them seemed to ease. There was a shift in the air, a quiet understanding forming between them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Shaq walked out into the cool night, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The next morning, as he reviewed the menu with Rosa, a sudden text notification popped up on his phone. It was from Layla. "Layla, we've received a complaint. A big one. Someone's threatening to pull their investment if things don't improve. Shaq's heart dropped. Shaq stared at the message on his phone, the words blurring in front of his eyes. A complaint, an investor threatening to pull out. His heart raced as the implication set in. The restaurant, the changes, the fragile progress he had fought for, it was all hanging by a thread. Layla had attached an email detailing the investor's concerns. From the sounds of it, the complaint wasn't just about the service or the food, it was about the atmosphere, the vibe that had yet to shift entirely. The investor felt that the restaurant was losing its unique charm, the very thing that had made it stand out in the first place. Shaq leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. His mind raced, but no solution presented itself. He knew that one wrong move could cause everything to unravel. He stood up abruptly, pacing the length of his office. The restaurant was more than just a business to him. It was a community, a place where people came together to share stories, food, and laughter. And yet, all that seemed in jeopardy now. Rosa's face flashed in his mind. He had promised her, and the rest of the team, that they would make this work. He couldn't let it all fall apart now. Not after everything they had been through. "Shaq?" The voice was soft, but it stopped him in his tracks. He turned to find Layla standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with concern. "You saw the message," she said, her voice steady but not without emotion. Shaq nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on him. I don't know what to do. If we lose this investor, we're done. And everything we've worked for, everything I've tried to change. He trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. Layla stepped inside and closed the door behind her. You've been fighting this battle alone for too long, Shaq. Maybe it's time to bring the team in on this. He shook his head, frustration bubbling up. They have enough to worry about already. Rosa, Trevor, the others, they're all struggling with the changes. I can't burden them with this. But you're not alone, Layla insisted. They care about this place, just as much as you do. Maybe more than you realize. If you trust them with this challenge, they might surprise you. Shaq looked down at his phone again, reading the investor's demands. It wasn't just about meeting expectations, it was about changing the heart and soul of what they had built. And that felt impossible. But Layla was right. They had come this far together, hadn't they? Maybe it was time to lean on the team, to show them that they were all in this together, not just the restaurant's success, but its survival. He looked up at Layla, a determination building in his chest. Okay. I'll talk to them. The staff gathered that evening, after the last customer had left. Shaq stood in front of them, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He could feel their eyes on him, expectant, curious, and just a little bit wary. Listen, Shaq began, his voice steady but laced with urgency. I just received some news. We've got an investor who's threatening to pull out if we don't make some serious changes, and fast. The room fell silent. Shaq could feel the weight of their gazes. We've come a long way. But we're not there yet. There's still work to do, and it's going to be hard. But I can't do it alone. I need all of you more than ever. Rosa was the first to speak, her voice quiet but firm. What do we need to do? Shaq looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every person there. We need to remind ourselves why we're doing this. Why we're here. And we need to find a way to balance the changes with what made this place special in the first place. We're a family. And it's time we showed the world that. Trevor, who had been silent until now, stood up slowly. His face was unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of understanding. I get it now, he said, his voice low. We're all in this together. If we fall apart, we all fall. So, let's fix it. Shaq nodded, a small but relieved smile spreading across his face. Exactly. The room seemed to breathe in unison, a shared sense of resolve spreading among them. In that moment, Shaq felt a glimmer of hope, a feeling he hadn't had in weeks. They were ready. They were going to do this. Together. Over the next few days, the team worked harder than they ever had before. They brainstormed ideas, revisited the menu, and made small tweaks to the ambience. Shaq made sure to check in with each of them, asking for their input, valuing their opinions. It wasn't just about him making decisions, it was about the team taking ownership of their vision. Trevor started to step up in ways Shaq hadn't expected. He began offering suggestions, helping Miguel train new staff, and even started interacting more with customers. His hard exterior had softened, and it was clear he was fully invested now. One afternoon, as they gathered for a meeting in the back office, Shaq looked around the room, feeling a swell of pride. They were doing it. They were turning things around. We've got one last thing to do, he said, standing up. We need to show the investor that we're serious. I'm going to take our changes, our vision, and present it to him. But I want all of you to know something. You've earned my respect. I've never been prouder of this team. Rosa smiled warmly, her eyes glowing. We're all in this together. Shaq nodded, his heart full. Right. Let's show them what we've got. The night of the presentation arrived. Shaq stood before the investor, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the weight of everything he had worked for riding on this moment. But as he spoke, he remembered something Rosa had said. If we push too hard, we might lose them. He wasn't going to push. He was going to show the investor exactly what the team had done, not just as a business, but as a family. He shared their story, the changes they had made, the heart and soul they had poured into the restaurant. He spoke of growth, but also of honoring the past, of remembering what made the restaurant special to begin with. The investor listened, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. When Shaq finished, the room was still. Finally, the investor leaned forward. "You've got my attention," he said, his voice measured. "But words aren't enough. Show me the results. I'll be back in a week." Shaq nodded, his heart still racing. "We'll show you." As Shaq walked out of the meeting, his mind was buzzing with possibilities. They still had a week. A week to prove everything they had worked for. A week to show that their vision was more than just a dream, it was a future. But for now, Shaq knew one thing: no matter what happened, they had already won. They had found their strength, together.